The printing press is one of those inventions we all learn about in school. It changed the world, right? But here's the thing. For about 500 years, economists have been stuck on this massive puzzle. If the printing press was so revolutionary, why is it so darn hard to find its impact in the economic data? Well, it turns out they were looking in completely the wrong place. And today, we are going to solve that mystery.
All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at what historians have always said about the press. Then, we'll dive into that weird economic puzzle that had everyone stumped. After that, we'll see how a totally new approach, focusing on cities, changed the game. We'll even make a quick stop in Venice, which was kind of the Silicon Valley of its day for publishing. And then we get to the big reveal, the stunning data that finally cracked the case, and what it all means for how we think about technology.
So to really get why this was such a mystery, you first have to appreciate just how big of a deal historians thought this invention was. And I mean, for them, this wasn't just some small step forward. It was a world-altering leap.
Just listen to that. The most radical transformation in the entire history of Western civilization. Historians aren't just saying it changed how people read. They're arguing it fundamentally rewired how people think and share ideas. That's a huge claim.
Think about that for a second. The impact is being put on the same level as the invention of writing. Before the press, a book was this incredibly rare, expensive, handcrafted luxury. After the press, information could suddenly be copied and spread with a speed and on a scale that was just completely unimaginable before.
And this one really cements the view. The printing press isn't just a side note to the Renaissance. For a lot of scholars, it was the engine that powered the whole thing. It gets credit for fueling the Reformation, the scientific revolution, basically the birth of the modern world as we know it.
So, okay, you've got this technology that historians are calling the most radical transformation ever. You'd naturally expect to see a massive, undeniable explosion in economic growth, right? Well, that's where our mystery really begins. For decades, economists went looking for that explosion. They dug through all the data, searching for that Gutenberg boom in national wealth and productivity. And you know what they found? Nothing. A big, fat zero. A complete flatline.
So when they looked at the big picture, the economies of entire countries, the effect just vanished. It was like this world-changing invention had somehow left no economic footprint at all. It created this huge disconnect between what historians were saying and what the economists were seeing in the numbers.
So the theory that everyone kind of settled on was pretty simple. Sure, printing was a huge deal for the people who actually made and read books. But in the grand scheme of things, in an economy based mostly on farming, the entire book industry was just a tiny, tiny drop on the bucket. It was just too small to move the needle on a whole country's GDP.
And that explanation pretty much held up for a long time, until a 2009 paper by an economist named Jeremiah Dittmar came along and suggested something kind of radical. What if we've just been looking in the wrong place this whole time? What if the impact wasn't at the national level, but somewhere much, much smaller?
And here's the key insight. Printing wasn't a rural technology. Presses were set up in cities, and the people buying the books weren't farmers, they were the urban middle class, merchants, lawyers, doctors, people whose jobs depended on reading and writing and numbers. The action was all happening in the cities.
Okay, but this creates a whole new problem. You can't just compare cities with a press to cities without one. Why not? Well, because printers were entrepreneurs. They didn't set up shop in some random backwater town. They went to the places that were already big, important, often with a university. It's not a fair fight. You'd be comparing apples to oranges.
This is where things get really clever. Dittmar used a statistical method to create a statistical twin for every city that got a printing press. The model looks at all the things that mattered: size, location, having a university, and calculates the probability that any city would get a press. Then it finds another city that didn't get a press, but had an almost identical probability. So now you have a perfect control group. It's as close as you can get to a real scientific experiment, but with history. So, before we look at the results of that huge analysis, let's see what this city-level boom actually looked like in the real world. And there is no better place to look than Venice, which became the undisputed king of the 15th century publishing world. So you've got this guy, Aldus Manutius. He's a visionary entrepreneur. In 1494, he starts the Aldine Press in Venice, but he's not just churning out the same old stuff. He's completely reinventing the book. He creates these smaller, portable octavo books. Think of them as the first paperbacks. And then he develops italic type. Now, it looked great, sure, but the real genius was that it was compact.
You could fit way more words on a page, which slashed his costs. And the effect of these innovations was just profound. By making books smaller, cheaper, and easier to carry around, Manutius did something truly revolutionary. He took knowledge out of the monastery and the palace and put it right into the hands of the middle class. And this democratization of information turned Venice into an absolute beast. Within a century, half of all the print shops in Europe were located there.
You can just picture it, right? The streets of Venice weren't just about canals and gondolas anymore. They were a chaotic, buzzing marketplace for ideas. You had workshops for printers, binders, illustrators popping up everywhere. It was this vibrant, competitive ecosystem, all driving a brand new kind of commerce, all powered by the printed word.
So that's the story of one city. But was it a one-off fluke, or was this happening all across Europe? Well, let's get back to the data and finally see the solution to our 500-year-old mystery.
First, this is the all-important control test. The analysis looked at the century before the printing press really spread, from 1400 to 1500. And what did it find? The cities that would later get a press were growing at almost the exact same rate as their statistical twins. This proves the method worked. We really are comparing apples to apples.
But then, in the next century, from 1500 to 1600, after the press had taken hold, everything changes. Just look at that divergence. The cities with printing presses absolutely took off, leaving their identical twins way behind. This is it. This is the visual proof, the smoking gun of the printing press's hidden economic power.
And here is the answer to our mystery, the final number. Cities that adopted the printing press grow, on average, a staggering 60% faster than similar cities that didn't. It wasn't that the press had no economic impact, it's that the impact was incredibly concentrated, supercharging the growth of the urban centers that embraced it. Mystery solved.
So a 60% growth advantage is massive. But what was actually driving it? I mean, it wasn't just that more people were reading philosophy or Bibles. The real economic engine here was the spread of practical, commercial knowledge.
You see, the printing press is a perfect example of what economists call a general-purpose technology, just like the steam engine or the internet. It's an innovation that doesn't just improve one little industry, it transforms everything. Printers started publishing technical manuals on accounting, on mathematics, on metallurgy, on business practices. For the very first time, this kind of commercial know-how could be standardized and shared widely, giving businesses in these cities a massive competitive edge.
And this incredible piece of economic detective work leaves us with a really fascinating question for our own time. It took us 500 years to figure out how to properly measure the economic impact of the 15th century's information revolution. So how sure are we that we're measuring the right things to understand the true impact of our own? Are we still looking at the big, aggregate national level when maybe the real revolution is happening in specific hubs, rewiring our world in ways we haven't even begun to quantify? It's definitely something to think about.